5 offensive linemen. Gone. Not benched, not rotated, completely wiped off the starting lineup. And when news started circulating that the Cleveland Browns were preparing to replace all 5 starters in front of their young quarterback, people around the league didn't just raise eyebrows, they froze. Because that almost never happens. Teams tweak, teams adjust, teams maybe swap 1 or 2 pieces, but an entire offensive line? That's not maintenance, that's a reset button. At first, it looked like desperation, a front office scrambling after a rough stretch, a coaching staff trying to shake up chemistry. But the more you looked at it, the less random it felt. Replacing every blocker protecting your quarterback doesn't happen unless something deeper is fractured. Offensive lines are built on continuity, timing, communication, trust. You don't throw all of that away unless the trust is already broken. And that's where the questions started getting uncomfortable. Because while the national conversation focused on surface-level struggles, sacks, stalled drives, messy pockets, something wasn't adding up. There were moments on film where the pocket collapsed almost instantly. Plays where rushers came through untouched, snaps where the breakdown looked less like miscommunication and more like confusion that kept repeating itself, over and over. Fans began rewinding games, slowing clips down, looking at angles differently. Because when you see the same kind of protection failure at critical moments, coincidence starts to feel thin. Now here's where it gets interesting. At the same time all of this was unfolding, Shedeur Sanders was still flashing, 3rd and long conversions under pressure, tight window throws in the red zone, calm footwork while chaos unfolded around him. The contrast was glaring. The quarterback didn't look overwhelmed, the protection did. So when the organization finally made the move, clearing out the entire starting line, it felt less like panic and more like a statement, a loud one. There are rumors floating that the situation may have involved more than just performance issues. Some insiders claim internal frustration had been building for months. Others suggest that what looked like growing pains might have been something far more complicated. Nothing officially confirmed, of course, but the timing, the scale of the reset, it raised eyebrows league-wide. Because here's the real question no one could ignore. Was this just about fixing a struggling unit? Or was this about protecting a quarterback the franchise quietly decided it couldn't afford to lose? Think about it. You don't dismantle an entire offensive front unless you're choosing a direction, and replacing 5 starters sends a clear message. Someone's future mattered more than continuity. Someone's development was worth blowing up the old structure. And once that possibility enters the conversation, everything changes. Because now this isn't just a football adjustment, it's a power shift. And what that shift reveals about the Browns and about Shedeur Sanders might be bigger than anyone expected. But this was only the beginning. At first glance, it looked simple. The offense stalled, sacks piled up, drives died before they even had a chance to breathe. And, like it always does in the NFL, the spotlight swung straight to the quarterback. Was Shedeur holding the ball too long? Was he missing reads? Was the speed of the league catching up to him? That became the easy narrative. Headlines questioned his readiness, analysts pointed at box scores, local segments debated whether he needed more time to develop, and on the surface, if you just skimmed the stats, it almost made sense. The numbers didn't always scream dominance. There were stalled possessions, there were ugly 3rd downs, there were moments that looked chaotic. But when people actually went back and watched the tape, something felt off. Because collapse usually has rhythm, it follows mistakes, it builds from bad decisions. This didn't look like that. This looked abrupt. Snaps where the pocket didn't even form, rushers blowing through untouched lanes before routes had time to develop, protection calls that seemed delayed by half a second, just enough to break the timing of the play. And it wasn't once or twice, it was consistent. Consistency is what turned frustration into suspicion. If it were random, you'd see variety, different breakdowns, different weak points. Instead, the pressure kept appearing at the worst possible moments, 3rd and long, red zone possessions, drives where momentum was just starting to shift.
Meanwhile, Shedeur wasn't panicking. He stepped up through closing gaps, he slid laterally to buy an extra heartbeat, he kept his eyes downfield when most young quarterbacks would have dropped them and bailed. There were throws under duress that shouldn't have been completed, and yet somehow were. Tight windows, perfect placement, calm resets in collapsing space. That's not the behavior of a quarterback drowning. That's someone fighting upstream. And that's when fans started pushing back. Social media clipped plays in slow motion, frame-by-frame breakdowns started circulating. Pressure rate charts told a different story than touchdown totals did. When defenders are arriving in under 2 seconds, it changes everything. Routes don't fully break, timing adjustments get rushed, even elite veterans struggle in that kind of storm. But the public conversation didn't begin there. It began, and for weeks stayed, centered on the quarterback. That disconnect is what made this feel strange, because if protection failure is constant, yet criticism flows heavily in one direction, something about the evaluation process doesn't sit right.
Was it youth bias? Was it impatience? Or was it simply easier to critique the most visible position on the field? Whatever the explanation, the narrative hardened quickly. He's not ready. He's forcing throws. The moment might be too big. Yet every time the pocket briefly held up, even for a second longer than usual, he delivered. The flashes weren't rare. They were buried between chaos. And that's where the collapse didn't add up. If a quarterback is truly overwhelmed, you see unraveling, you see hesitation, you see confidence crack. Instead, what you saw was resilience, adjustments, composure, which forced a bigger question into the room. If the quarterback wasn't folding under pressure, why did the structure around him keep folding instead? And that question is what shifted everything. That's when the whispers started. Not the loud, headline-grabbing kind, the quieter kind, the kind that moves through insiders, beat writers, and message boards before anyone with a microphone is willing to say it out loud. There were reports that Shedor's reps in practice had quietly been reduced at one point. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would spark outrage on its own, just subtle shifts. A few more snaps redirected elsewhere, a little more spotlight drifting toward another quarterback in the room. Publicly, it was framed as competition, development, keeping everyone sharp. But some fans weren't buying it, because at the same time those changes were happening, protection issues on game day were getting worse. And when two storylines run parallel like that, people start connecting dots, even if no one officially confirms the picture. There was also buzz about internal disagreements over offensive direction. Nothing verified, no official statement, but several league voices suggested there were philosophical differences behind closed doors. How quickly the offense should lean into Shedeur, how much freedom he should have at the line, whether to scale things back or open things up. Again, speculation, but speculation gains power when timing feels suspicious. Then came the most talked about shift, moments when the backup quarterback, Dillon Gabriel, began receiving more public attention. Not necessarily starting, not necessarily replacing anyone, but getting highlighted, mentioned, positioned as an option. On the surface, that's normal quarterback room politics. Teams explore depth, coaches protect themselves with alternatives. That's part of the business. But here's where it got uncomfortable. Right as those conversations gained traction, the protection breakdown started looking even less like coincidence. Fans began noticing missed assignments at eerily critical times, half steps in the wrong direction, delayed reactions to blitz looks that had been identified pre-snap, repeated confusion on stunts that veteran linemen typically handle in their sleep. Missed blocks happen, communication errors happen, but patterns? Patterns create questions. No one inside the building went on record accusing anyone of anything. Let's be clear about that. There is no official claim of sabotage, no documented proof of intentional breakdowns. But online, the phrase started circulating anyway. People began saying it felt strategic, like limiting exposure without openly benching him, like letting the environment speak louder than the coaching staff ever would. And here's the dangerous part about that kind of narrative. Once it enters the conversation, you can't easily erase it.
even if it's exaggerated, even if it's partly fueled by fan frustration. The sheer possibility reshapes perception, because if friction exists internally, if belief in the quarterback isn't unanimous, instability spreads quietly. And instability doesn't need dramatic explosions. Sometimes it just needs hesitation, a miscommunication here, a missed read there, a pocket that collapses a fraction too quickly. Was it politics? Was it coincidence? Was it simply a young offense struggling to find rhythm? Officially, we don't know. But what we do know is this: the rumors didn't slow down. And then the organization made the kind of move that turned whispers into full-blown conversation. 5 offensive linemen. All gone. And suddenly, speculation didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. Then it happened. Not a benching, not a quiet rotation, not a "we're evaluating week-to-week" statement. A complete reset. All 5 starting offensive linemen out. When the move became official, the reaction around the league wasn't subtle. Analysts paused mid-segment. Former players called it unprecedented because offensive lines are built like ecosystems. You don't rip out the entire foundation unless the structure was already unstable. Continuity is everything up front. Chemistry takes years. Trust takes thousands of reps. Teams fight to preserve that. Cleveland didn't preserve it. They detonated it. And that's when the tone of the conversation shifted. Suddenly, the question wasn't, is Shedeur ready? It became, what was really happening in front of him? Because replacing 1 lineman says performance issue, replacing 2 says adjustment, replacing 5 says something broke at a structural level. It's rare in modern NFL history to see that kind of collective removal. Contracts, cap implications, locker room politics, none of that is small. Yet the front office pulled the trigger anyway. That alone tells you how serious they believe the situation was. Behind closed doors, there were reportedly tense film sessions, internal evaluations, effort grades that didn't align with expectations. Nothing officially released in detail, but multiple league voices hinted that the review process was not flattering. There were mentions of miscommunications that repeated too often, assignments missed in identical fashion, timing that looked just slightly off at critical moments. Not enough to scream wrongdoing, but enough to justify a hard reset. And here's what made it louder. The organization didn't drag it out. They didn't defend the unit publicly. They didn't spin a long narrative about development curves. They acted. When franchises act that decisively, it usually means the decision was already made long before it became public, which brings us back to the quarterback. Because you don't burn down your entire offensive line unless you're protecting something more valuable. This wasn't just about sacks, it was about direction. It was Cleveland choosing a centerpiece. Fans immediately revisited game film with new eyes. Plays that once looked chaotic now looked revealing. The red zone pressures, the 3rd and long breakdowns, the split-second collapses. With hindsight, those moments felt less random and more connected. Whether that connection was intentional or just systemic failure is still debated, but one thing became undeniable: the narrative had flipped. Shedeur Sanders wasn't the problem being evaluated anymore. He was the investment being defended. And that's a major shift inside any franchise, because when a team publicly resets its protection units, it signals belief, it signals commitment, it signals that the quarterback's development matters more than protecting reputations. The building went quieter after that. Media criticism softened. Mock drafts started focusing on support pieces instead of replacements. The language around Shedeur changed from project to centerpiece. All because 5 chairs were suddenly empty. But the reset didn't end there. Because fixing the line is only part of the equation. What happens next, in the draft room, in the receiver room, in the culture itself, will determine whether this reset becomes redemption or just another chapter in Cleveland chaos. Fixing the offensive line solved one problem, but it exposed another. Because once the protection conversation cooled down, attention shifted somewhere else. The receiver room. And that's where things got just as interesting. On paper, the Browns' wide receiver group heading into 2026 doesn't look disastrous. There's talent, there's speed, there are recognizable names. But football isn't played on paper. It's played in timing windows measured in fractions of seconds. And when your quarterback is under development or under pressure, chemistry matters more than resumes. That's where the questions began. Isaiah Bond's growth stood out immediately. Every snap looked sharper. Routes snapped off cleaner. Adjustments during scramble drills felt natural instead of forced. You could see it building, that unspoken understanding between quarterback and receiver that can't be coached overnight. It looked organic. Meanwhile, not every connection on the field carried that same rhythm. There were throws where timing felt a half step off, routes that drifted slightly beyond their intended depth, moments where Shedeur expected a break inside and the receiver settled outside. None of it dramatic, none of it headline-worthy individually, but again, patterns matter. Fans noticed. They always do. And once people started evaluating the receiver room through the lens of alignment, the conversation shifted from talent to trust. Because wide receiver and quarterback relationships are fragile. If one side hesitates, the entire play collapses. If one side freelances, the read breaks down. And after what many are calling the chaos stretch, some fans began wondering if every piece in that room was fully synchronized with the direction of the offense. Now, let's be careful here. There is no confirmed internal feud, no official statement of friction between Shedeur and any specific receiver. The Browns haven't labeled anyone as resistant or problematic, but there has been buzz. Some reports claim the previous coaching philosophy created uneven loyalties within position groups. Others suggest certain veterans were more tied to the old system than the evolving one. That's natural in the NFL. Regime changes always create subtle fault lines. The question is whether those fault lines still exist.
Because this is no longer about best available talent. It's about cohesion. When a franchise chooses its quarterback, every skill player must align with that decision. No leftover agendas, no side currents. The offense can't afford split energy anymore. And here's where it becomes strategic. Cleveland enters the draft with capital, 10 picks, multiple early round opportunities. That gives them flexibility, but it also increases pressure. Do they double down on building chemistry? Do they add new weapons? Do they quietly phase out pieces that don't fully sync? Every option sends a message. If they stand pat, it suggests belief in internal growth. If they invest heavily at receiver, it suggests they want cleaner alignment. If they move on from certain veterans, even subtly, it signals culture over contracts. And after a full offensive line purge, culture clearly matters. Isaiah Bond feels like part of the forward momentum. You can see it in the body language, the on-field adjustments, the competitive edge. That's the type of partnership that elevates quarterbacks. But can the entire receiver room reflect that same energy? That's the real question. Because fixing protection gives Shedeur time, but perfect timing with his receivers, that's what turns flashes into dominance. And if Cleveland truly believes this is the beginning of a new era, then the receiver room has to mirror that belief completely. No hesitation, no misalignment, no remnants of the previous instability, just synchronization. Because now the spotlight isn't on whether the quarterback can survive chaos, it's on whether the pieces around him can finally move in rhythm. Now comes the real test. Because resetting the offensive line makes noise, adjusting the receiver room raises questions, but the 2026 NFL Draft? That's where a franchise proves what it truly believes. Cleveland isn't walking into this draft empty-handed. They're holding real capital. 10 total picks, 2 first-rounders, depth selections stretching across multiple rounds. That's not just flexibility, that's power, and power reveals intention. The pressure isn't about finding talent.
It's about sending a message. After everything that unfolded, the protection collapse, the rumors of internal friction, the full-line reset, the Browns' draft strategy can't be random. Every pick will be read as a signal. Is this about rebuilding quietly? Or is this about going all in around Shedeur Sanders?
Mock drafts have already started flying. Analysts debating linebacker value, edge depth, best player available logic. Some projections suggest defensive reinforcement. Others argue Cleveland needs to balance the roster long-term. But here's the thing. Long-term planning doesn't matter if the quarterback's environment isn't secure. You don't wipe out 5 starters and absorb that kind of shockwave just to draft casually. This draft room carries weight. If their first-round selections don't directly improve protection, weaponry, or structural support for the offense, fans will notice. The internet doesn't forget the narrative of the past year, and after the reset, expectations are no longer patient, they're urgent. Because this isn't about stockpiling talent, it's about alignment. Quarterbacks in today's NFL dictate tempo and identity. Franchises don't mold elite quarterbacks into the system anymore. They construct systems around them. And after everything Shedeur endured during the chaos stretch, there's an argument to be made that he's earned that level of commitment. Which raises a simple but heavy question. Are the Browns drafting for balance or drafting for him? There's a difference. Best player available sounds smart in theory. It sounds disciplined. But best player for the quarterback changes trajectories faster. Offensive tackles who anchor instead of hesitate. Receivers who run routes like clockwork. Tight ends who become safety valves under pressure. Those aren't luxury picks, they're insurance policies. And right now, this franchise can't afford another season of instability. Because if the draft reinforces Shedeur's protection and weaponry, the message becomes clear: he's the centerpiece. If it doesn't, the doubt creeps back. You can already feel how tightly this draft is tied to perception. One aggressive offensive investment and optimism explodes. One indifferent pick at a position that doesn't directly serve the quarterback, and the criticism returns instantly. That's the pressure. Front offices don't just draft players, they draft narratives, they draft culture shifts, they draft proof of belief.
And make no mistake, the league will be watching Cleveland's first pick like it's a referendum, because after resetting the line and cleaning out instability, this is the moment where the Browns prove whether that reset was cosmetic or foundational. And if they commit fully, the league might be witnessing the official launch of a franchise built entirely around its quarterback. But if they hesitate, all that chaos they just cleared out could start creeping back in. The draft isn't just about filling holes anymore, it's about defining the era. The changes on the roster were visible, but the real transformation isn't happening on the depth chart, it's happening in the culture. Because once a franchise replaces an entire offensive line and heads into a draft under this much pressure, something deeper is shifting behind the scenes. You don't make those kinds of decisions unless you're redefining hierarchy, unless you're clarifying who the centerpiece is, unless the internal message is no longer up for debate. And in Cleveland, that message feels clear. For a stretch, there were too many side conversations, too many subtle doubts, too many public debates about readiness instead of execution. Whether that friction was exaggerated by fans or quietly fueled by internal disagreement, it created instability. And instability in an NFL locker room spreads faster than people realize. Quarterbacks feel it first. When belief isn't unified, it shows in timing, it shows in confidence, it shows in how aggressively a team plays on third down. And during that chaotic phase, there were moments where the energy felt split, not explosive, not synchronized. Now, it feels different. The line reset wasn't just about sacks, it was about accountability. It was about declaring that hesitation and inconsistency wouldn't be tolerated, that protection wasn't optional, that alignment matters more than reputation. That's a culture statement. And culture resets are rarely gentle. They're decisive. They're uncomfortable. They draw a line in the locker room. You're either aligned with the direction or you become part of the past. That's how contenders evolve. They don't drag uncertainty forward, they eliminate it. What makes this shift powerful is timing. Shedeur Sanders isn't in the prove you belong phase anymore.
He moved past that when he kept delivering under pressure. He moved past that when the organization chose to reconstruct the foundation around him. That kind of move doesn't happen for a placeholder quarterback. It happens for someone you're betting the next several years on. And when a team makes that bet, everyone else adjusts. Receivers refine their timing, coaches simplify communication, play calling becomes more tailored. The energy shifts from evaluation to empowerment. That's the difference between building cautiously and building confidently. There were rumors of friction during the earlier stretch, whispers of differing visions, of uneven support. Nothing formally confirmed, but even the suggestion of internal misalignments can fracture momentum. Now, with structural changes complete, those whispers carry less weight, because actions speak louder than speculation. Replacing 5 linemen silenced doubt more effectively than any press conference could. It told the locker room, this direction isn't temporary. And when players understand that stability exists at the quarterback position, the room settles. Competition becomes sharper but cleaner. Communication tightens. Execution improves. Culture clarity does that. It removes gray areas. For too long, Cleveland felt reactive, answering noise, managing narratives, adjusting week to week. Now, it feels like they're choosing a lane. When the ball is snapped next season, the difference won't just be technical, it'll be psychological. Linemen blocking with conviction instead of hesitation, receivers finishing routes knowing exactly where the ball will be, coaches calling plays without looking over their shoulders. That's what alignment looks like. And if this culture shift fully locks in, something important happens. The chaos that once defined the storyline becomes fuel instead of shadow. Because teams don't just rebuild structures, they rebuild identity. And if Cleveland truly embraced this reset, if they removed the friction, clarified leadership, and committed to their quarterback without reservation, then this isn't just roster management, it's transformation. The era of scattered energy is over. The era of unified direction has begun.
So after all of it, the protection breakdowns, the whispers of internal tension, the historic offensive line reset, the looming draft pressure, the culture shift, we're left with one real question. Was this collapse a warning, or was it the beginning of something bigger? Because when you strip everything down, what happened in Cleveland wasn't just a roster shuffle. It was a moment of truth. A franchise faced instability, faced growing noise, faced the risk of mishandling a young quarterback, and instead of doubling down on excuses, they detonated the structure and rebuilt it. That doesn't happen by accident. Shedeur Sanders didn't crumble during the chaos. He didn't shrink when the pocket collapsed. He didn't let the outside narrative define him. If anything, the turbulence revealed something more important than clean stat lines ever could: resilience. And resilience forces organizations to choose. Either you hesitate and keep hedging your bets, or you commit and build with conviction. Cleveland made their move. 5 linemen gone, draft strategy under a microscope, cultural alignment tightening around one centerpiece. Those aren't small adjustments, those are franchise-shaping decisions. But here's the part that still lingers. A reset only works if it's complete. If the protection stabilizes, if the receiver room fully synchronizes, if the draft reflects intentional support, if leadership stays unified behind the quarterback. If. Because the NFL doesn't reward half measures. The sabotage rumors, whether exaggerated or partially true, created a shadow. The only way to erase that shadow isn't with press statements, it's with production, it's with dominance that makes debate irrelevant. And that's where this story gets interesting. If Shedeur was flashing under pressure, what happens when the pressure isn't self-inflicted? What happens when 3rd and long doesn't feel like survival mode? What happens when the pocket forms the way it's supposed to? That's when potential turns into reality. The league has seen talented quarterbacks struggle in dysfunctional environments. It has also seen franchises transform overnight once alignment clicks. The difference usually isn't talent, it's trust, it's structure, it's belief moving in the same direction.
Right now, Cleveland stands at that crossroads. They've clothed the chaos chapter. They've cleared the internal fog. They've signaled commitment. But the real verdict comes on Sundays. Because if this rebuild is authentic, if the organization truly shifted from managing narratives to empowering their quarterback, then the next phase won't just be competitive, it will be undeniable. And if that happens, the story won't be about sabotage anymore. It won't be about collapse. It won't even be about the historic reset. It will be about what the league watched unfold when a young quarterback survived the storm and finally stepped into clear skies. So the real question isn't whether Cleveland fixed the past, it's whether the rest of the NFL is ready for what happens next.